My name's Ian Lowe. I'm a superannuated scientist, but not yet senile, so I've been afforded the privilege of chairing the last session and trying to introduce three wonderful speakers. And if I'm able to shut them up in time, you'll be subjected to some concluding remarks from me as well before you escape. This session is called Can We Feed All the People and Not Destroy the Earth? And I assume that's based on the old adage, you can fuel some of the people all the time and you can fuel all of the people some of the time, but you can't fuel all of the people all of the time. We have three distinguished speakers to address this topic. The first is Dr. Nicole Chalmer. She's a farmer who has regenerated a property at Esperance, but she's also the author of Ecoagriculture for a Sustainable Food Future. Author and farmer, welcome Nick Chalmer.
Thank you, Ian. So quickly my background, I have been farming for about 30 years. My husband and I did not come from a farming background. We knew absolutely nothing about it when we first started. We didn't start at Esperance. We started at Denmark, which is on the west side of Albany, in a much higher rainfall zone. And we had all these ideals, which luckily we had a really good mentor at Denmark, a dairy farmer and beef farmer who helped us over some of the hurdles and the preconceptions that we had about escaping from the city. So we eventually ended up in Esperance because we could buy a very big farm there that had been, because it was badly degraded, went at really low prices. And we thought, yeah, we can do this. But what we didn't realise was how long it was going to take. And it was a very exhausting experience, which I would not recommend to anybody. But after being on that farm for several years and finally getting things working, I wasn't really happy with the way that whole district sort of viewed agriculture. And I thought I would like to look at how agriculture had been, or food production systems had existed in that region through history and prehistory, but far back as the Pleistocene. And I found a supervisor at UWA, and when I had told her that I wanted to start in the Pleistocene, she said, oh, you've picked something that's going to be too big. But I'm really stubborn, and I did it. So I actually did it. So this talk is a really brief sort of summary of some of the things I approached in my book, and that is in my book. And if you want more details, get the book. So eco-agriculture. The term eco-agriculture actually came from my original terminology, where I decided to call what Aboriginal people were doing in Australia eco-farming, because they were producing a system that was reliable. They knew what they were going to get, how much food they were going to get throughout the year at most times, and they managed the landscape for that certainty. At the same time, they were using the natural ecological systems and fitting into those ecological systems as part of it to produce food. So I'd like to acknowledge, I'd like to acknowledge the people of this country, and all the Indigenous peoples, but also all those people who are trying to practice some form of eco-farming and eco-agriculture. In my country, where I come from, I would thank the Noongar and Naju peoples of the southeast coast, because a number of them helped me with interviews and telling me how they used to do things. And they're on the east coast of WA. And also, I want to thank all the animals, plants, and other living beings that allow us to live in this country and on this planet. So as humans, we are part of nature's biophysical systems, and we can't stand alone. Nature is a public good. Shouldn't we all pay for it? So I've just got these two contrasting slides. Oh, into the microphone, sorry. So the slide A is a photograph taken in Australia of a eroding, degrading landscape, probably after a drought. The picture on the right is Saudi Arabia. Basically, I'm saying, do we want Australia to be like this? Do we want Australia to end up looking like Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia is a long history of land mismanagement. yet it's probably pretty short when you compare it to how long people have been in Australia. So what we often forget is that Australia and New Guinea were once joined, and it was all one country called Sahel in the Pleistocene. Before humans lived in Australia, it was a biodiverse animal-plant landscape populated with a huge range of species in ecological systems that function to make life as wide as possible. It appears that, and I know people have been talking about 60,000 years, but I can only talk about what I've found out in my research. So it appears that between 50 to 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens came to Australia. There may well have been another human species here beforehand, maybe the Denisovans, which compose, no one in the world has got the DNA except Aboriginal people and some small populations in what is now New Guinea. So they've got about 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA as well as Neanderthal. So sometime after the first Homo sapiens arrived in Australia, there was a hydrological collapse between 40 to 50,000 years BP. So Lake Eyre, which was once a 25 square kilometre freshwater lake, and a number of other lakes to the north and along that stretch dried up, and appears to be a feedback linkage to wide-scale species extinctions that happened throughout this period. So Australia and New Guinea and Tasmania separated about 11,500 years BP. This is just some of the animals that used to be in Australia before Homo sapiens got here. The Gurniornis, which in Aboriginal myths and legends was called a thunderbird. It was about the size of a moa, which means it was 4 to 6 times larger than modern emus. One of the major vertebrate predators was Thylacaleo carnifex. So it's having an interaction there with a human spear. And I don't think it won. So, and then probably the keystone grazing herbivore was Diprotodon octatum, which was the biggest known marsupial herbivore to ever exist in the Sahel region. It was probably about a tonne or more. It was still pretty small compared to the megafauna that used to live in North America and Africa, but in the Australian context, it was huge. It probably had a similar role to rhinoceros, grazing in small herds, controlling large vegetation, keeping large open spaces of perennial grasses, and grazed short, because those sort of animals also mitigate fire quite dramatically and prevent. In Africa, they mitigate fire dramatically, and with their demise, as is happening now, fire is also increasing in Africa. So Australia's deep human prehistory, as well as European invasion, has led to an aridified continent. There's evidence that ecosystems collapsed between 45 to 60,000 years ago, and vegetation changes led to rainfall decline and hydrological collapse. This hunting, overkill, and change fire and climate regimes led to the extinction of keystone species and ecosystem engineers. So it was not necessarily a direct, immediate thing that happened. It would have happened at different times in various places as humans moved throughout Australia. So in that period, 21 genera of 100 kilograms or more disappeared from the Australian Sahel landscape. Over 90% of marsupial species became extinct. Also, many birds, reptiles, and vital nutrient recycling insects, such as the large dung beetles that existed in Australia at that time, which have been found in the fossil record. So by reintroducing dung beetles here, we are really just reintroducing the past in a way. So there are enormous vegetation changes. Fire escaped without these grazers to keep grasses under control. And eventually the ancestral peoples learned how to manage their landscapes with highly complex fire systems. And this possibly prevented further aridification. They became the keystone culture in Australia. So Australia is quite unique compared to the other continents. We have no large predators left in this country. The only predator we have got, of course, that isn't human is dingoes. And in other countries, they would not be considered a keystone predator. They would be a mesopredator, a smaller predator. European invasion ended these Indigenous landscape management systems. Their new behaviours put economic gain ahead of country, and Australia is undergoing further aridification and species loss, 9 genera since European invasion. So this is just an illustration of what Australia was like pre-European compared to now. So as a West Australian, I know about this area pretty intimately. So my focus study area is Esperance, which is here. And it's the last area in Western Australia that was cleared on a large scale when clearing bans were brought in the mid-1980s, and no more clearing has been allowed in the southwest of Western Australia since. So the impacts of the second human invasion appear to start before the official occupation of Eastern Australia in 1788. And there's been research from dust and pollen that showed vegetation shifts that were typical of tree cover disappearance with sheep and cattle overgrazing. This pattern continued across Australia, and facilitated herds progressed in waves as ecological colonising agents. So the colonisers actually used their livestock as a way to change country and to take it over from the original inhabitants. Basically what they did was change ecosystems and habitats to such an extent that a lot of the fauna and flora that Aboriginal peoples relied upon as their food system disappeared because their habitats had been completely destroyed. So this extinction wave is ongoing. Habitats are still being destroyed by inappropriate clearing, overgrazing, poor cropping practices, and urbanisation is becoming a new threat. And Indigenous fire management systems are only practiced in very few areas in Australia now. This is just a close-up of what happened in Western Australia. So we've got this reconstruction of what it was like, what it was highly likely to have been like pre-European, and then this huge, massive area that was cleared from the late 1950s through to about 1985. I mean, we talk about the clearing of the Amazon and the clearing of, Borneo and other places in the world. While we've got this legacy here of a dramatically cleared landscape for one purpose, and that was to grow wheat and sheep. The impact it has had is still not recognised, really. One of the first things that started to happen was that the rainfall declined over the whole southwest of Western Australia, and this was before climate change became an issue. So, modelling has indicated that probably at least 40 to 60% of the annual rainfall decline in the southwest of Western Australia is due to this massive cleared mass of land. Charlie showed a really good image. I've seen it myself flying from Esperance. We flew across the rabbit-proof fence for a period and then cut across to Perth. It was like a gigantic force field in the sky. The wheat belt side, blue skies, hot, shimmering. The woodlands were covered with thousands and thousands of white clouds. The only places they came into the wheat belt was following small creeks and drainage lines. So I'm saying that basically to regenerate Australia, market-based philosophies do not work. And caring for this country must come before anything else, because without it, we are all gone. So agriculture is acknowledged as one of the largest contributors to climate change and biodiversity loss in Australia and worldwide. It's driven by cultural demands of our society and is part of what people have been conditioned to accept as food, the types of food that we are growing here. And food in Australia is exported as a commodity, important for GDP, even though it has less status than mineral exports. So basically, our society has come to expect food as a right, as a cheap right, that you shouldn't be having to pay too much for food. You should have plenty of money left over to spend on stuff. And it's driven by this fantasy paradigm of economics, which I call it a complete fairy tale of human construction. It does not fit within the natural world at all. Nothing grows forever. So the drive for a wool, wheat and beef export industry overgrazed and aridified the rangelands. The drive for wheat led to overclearing of the wheat belt. The one-way flow of energy and matter is away from farmlands and is totally unsustainable, and not just here in Western Australia, but throughout Australia. Exporting food from Australia, I believe, is unsustainable in the long term. And I'm sorry for those who think that that is a future way of getting farmers to improve their biodiversity by having more markets, unless you can address the energy, or I'll show it in the next slide anyway. And ecological literacy, I think, is vitally important across the whole of society. Children should be taught it from grade 1. Universities, every single faculty in any university should be teaching at least a year of ecological theory. We need to understand that we are part of a system, and that if we try to divorce ourselves from that, we are causing huge problems. So I believe that regenerating Australia shouldn't just be left to farmers and land managers. It's a society problem, a whole of society problem, and therefore it should be paid for by the whole of society. And it demands billions of dollars. Fairly recently, there was the saga about the French submarines. They were going to spend $90 billion on those. Australian regeneration environmental works is all costed at probably less than $100 million. Just think of the difference in where money is spent. It's not being spent in looking after this country that we all rely upon. Modern agricultural systems are linear. Everything goes one way. It goes elsewhere, away from the land. And I'm talking about macro fertilizers and micronutrients. This can be addressed because, for instance, in Western Australia, we are leading probably most of Australia in that most of the sewage produced in the city of Perth is now having toxins stripped from it, and it's being composted and then being taken out to farms beyond the city. That is what needs to happen everywhere. All waste, human or otherwise, has to go back to the land where it came from. And when I hear people talk about the bio waste on their farm, or they've got to sell off that straw because it's waste, it just beggars me to think that they are doing that. Basically, quickly, this is the farm we bought in Esperance, and it was being used for clover harvesting. All the topsoil had been virtually blown away, and over years we managed to regenerate it into something that looks like this. Green pastures. It is a spring-winter view, so it looks its best, but it's underlain by perennial pastures so that we gain any benefit from rain that comes through in the non-traditional growing season. So Esperance does get quite a lot of rain from between January and April. These are just some of the animals that we have on our farm in the fenced off natural bushland areas that we have protected over the years. So there's a heap of animals that live on this farm where we have lots of we have 2/3 pasture and 1/3 bush. These are some possibilities which I talk about in my book. Why do we always think that the only animals that we can eat are something that's come from the Northern Hemisphere or something that we have to manage? Some of these animals, which are called ferals, which we call ferals, forgetting that we ourselves are ferals, are in fact better adapted to living in Australia than the animals that we've brought here for other, the sheep and cattle that we've brought here. Dingoes. This is it. Oh, wrong one. Oh, how do you go back? That one. How do you go back? Red. Oh, okay. This dingo was filmed near Norseman. That is close to a pure dingo. Dingoes are not always yellow. They range in colour. They should be left in a lot of places in the rangelands now in Western Australia. They're regenerating them by including dingoes in their systems because they get rid of the overpopulations of kangaroos and other small feral animals like goats and can help regenerate whole landscapes. So I think that climate change is something that people have become so concerned with, they're forgetting about the other things that are happening on our planet, which is the loss of biodiversity, large-scale desertification, and the fact that the ways to beat it is to actually start regenerating vegetation in Australia, because I don't know much about the rest of the world, but I can see that if we could cover our Australian continent with vegetation from one side to the other, we can actually do something really positive and really incredible for our own country, which can be done everywhere. And the other thing is, I guess I have to say, is that human population cannot be decoupled from sustainability and resilience. Indigenous Australians and other Indigenous peoples were well aware of this and kept their populations below carrying capacity. So it was not accidental that they managed to live here for at least 40,000 years without completely degrading the landscapes. They controlled their populations. So basically, can I just finish this last one? Australia needs a food policy linked to determining its real long-term population carrying capacity. And that's if we have to start not depending on export income from agricultural products and having to start farming products that are farming animals and plants that better suit our landscapes. The true sustainability of present socioeconomic systems and how many people can Australia sustain in terms of ecologically produced food and the ending of urbanisation. So it must take into account the future availability of all inputs, such as peak phosphate, something I didn't get time to talk about. The world has only got a limited amount of phosphate. In Western Australia in particular, we cannot farm the animals and plants that we do without phosphate inputs because the soils are so low in natural phosphate. And with China cutting off 40% of the world phosphate supplies, it's sort of an indicator of what the future may hold in terms of running out of phosphate. Return nutrients to farms via treated sewage and other organic waste, retaining essential inputs, Australian phosphate and potassium, which are being discovered in deposits, which are within the market economy will end up mostly being exported to other countries instead of being used here, where we should be keeping it and not sending it overseas. It needs a landscape policy. What should future landscapes in Australia look like and be like? And how do we achieve this? A massive vegetation program from coast to coast, including the inland. Do we continue building on the best land? Well, the best land was around the cities. That's why people built cities there to start with. And they were also the lands that were occupied by the most Indigenous peoples. billions should be spent on on-ground work. And as I mentioned before, the 90 billion amount that was going to be buying on submarines. And fixing if all of these things are done, fixing carbon will just become automatic. It won't be something that you have to actually work for deliberately. It will just happen as part of the whole process. And won't do that. So I think it's basically we need to do, I think that in my view, we need to do these things and we need to do them urgently. And we need to start getting not just people who live on land and understand land and academics. We need to get as many people as possible from the wider population to start to understand this as well.